Hi everyone, I'm Zoe Ball. Welcome to today's webinar, Companies House Reform, What It Means to You. This is CRO's first lunchtime webinar and we have a whole programme of events planned over the next year. Our next webinar in September is on identity verification and we'll demo how facial recognition apps work and how these enhanced checks can help with due diligence. We'll be sending out more details nearer the time. Today's session is being presented by our Managing Director, Liz Kinsey, who has over 20 years of company secretarial experience. There is an opportunity to ask questions, so if you have any, just pop them in the questions box and we'll go through them at the end. I'd also like to note that this session is being recorded. So now I'd like to hand you over to Liz.
Hello everybody, and thank you for attending today's event. I'm just going to share my screen with everybody, and before I do so, I just want to let everybody know that we did test out the slideshow before earlier on today, and there was a delay with the slideshow. So because of that, we've decided that we don't want to cause any problems and me talking about something and a different slide showing. So we're just going to present as the PowerPoint presentation, which then seems to go from slide to slide at the appropriate time. So apologies for that, but I thought it was more important that you got to see the slide that I was talking about. So I'm going to go ahead and share now. Right, so hopefully now you can all see the first holding slide, which says Companies House Reform and What It Means to You. So today we're going to look at the Economic Crime and Corporate Transparency Act, and this session will take a look at the key aims of the legislation and what it means to you and your clients as well. Now, this is the biggest reform that Companies House has seen in its 180 years. So it's the biggest change to the framework for registering companies. And the third part that we're going to look at today is just an overview of the Register of Overseas Entities, which came into force a couple of years ago. As Zoe said at the beginning, there will be an opportunity to ask questions. So there is a question chat. If you just want to put your questions in there, and then we'll go through as many of those as we can do at the end. I will be sharing my slides with all the attendees as well, and my email address is on the last slide as well. So if you go away after today's session and you think, oh, I should have asked this, please don't hesitate, just contact me and hopefully I can answer your questions. So first of all, we're going to look at the key aims of the Act. I'm going to go through these and then we'll go back through them in a bit more detail. So firstly, there's a broadening to the registrar's powers. So the registrar will be seen to have new powers, and I'll be looking into what those new powers will be on some of the later slides. There's also going to be an improvement on the financial information that's shown on the register. And Companies House will have more investigation and enforcement powers, and we'll look at how those will be applied as well. There's also going to be an enhancement to the protection of personal information that's filed with Companies House. Now, this is going to be through the introduction of identity verification, or IDV, as it will be known. And the Act is going to target criminals and terrorists who abuse the UK economy. And this is to strengthen the UK's reputation as a place to do legitimate business. I'm sure most of you are also aware that since the Act came in, there was also a review of Companies House fees as well. Now, some of those main increases have been the price of incorporations, which have gone up from £12 to £50, and also confirmation statements as well have gone up from £13 to £34. So it's a substantial price increase, and Companies House haven't ruled out the possibility of another price increase next year as well. Now, for those of you who were around when the Companies Act 2006 came into force, you'll know that Companies House at that time spoke about the UK is the easiest and the cheapest place to register a limited company. Now, I'm not quite sure why that was ever a good thing. I think that the registering of an incorporation should be a considered event and should be taken seriously. But now we can see that Companies House also feel that way with some of the changes that they're going to be putting into force over the next few months or couple of years as well, as long as it takes them to implement the new legislation. So how are these changes going to affect you and your clients? That's what we really want to know. So from now on, all UK companies must maintain their own register of members. With the 06 Act, you could elect to have Companies House hold your register of members, but that will no longer be the case. So it's the company's responsibility to hold the register of members from now onwards. Every UK limited company must also provide an email address, and registered office addresses must be deemed to be appropriate, and we'll come back in a few minutes and look at what they mean by that term appropriate. Companies House also have the right to be able to order companies to rectify inconsistencies that have been filed on the register, and that's one of their new powers as well. So other changes will be the introduction of formal identity verification. Now, this will mean, once it's implemented, that if an individual is filing documents on behalf of somebody else, they will have to have their identity verified, and this is to tackle anonymous filings for companies. Also, new and existing directors and PSCs of UK companies will have to have their identity verified as well. Now, this will be a one-off verification procedure. For Companies House, they just want to confirm that that person is a real person, and this will be through either facial recognition software or a certified copy of a passport, which is uploaded to Companies House as well. So it's confirming that the person that's being appointed as a director or a PSC is a real person, and that can be matched by a copy of a passport as well. If the director or PSC is appointed to multiple companies, then they will be issued a code and they can use that for all the companies that they're appointed to. So they only have to go through the IDV procedure just the once. For new companies, this IDV process will happen before the company is incorporated. So it will mean that they'll need to go through that process before they can actually incorporate the company. For existing directors and PSCs of existing companies, once this legislation comes into play, it will be part of the next confirmation statement that's filed after that date, and they'll all have to be IDV'd at that point. So for a year, there's a huge amount of people that are going to have to go through this IDV process, and that will directly affect you and your clients as well. For other changes, there'll be further restrictions on the use of corporate directors coming in, and we're not quite sure what these restrictions are going to be, so we're waiting for more news on Companies House about how that will affect people. And also the Act will introduce measures on the filing requirements for financial information. So for micro entities and small companies, they will also need to submit a P&L as part of the accounts that are submitted to Companies House. And also, once this legislation comes in, All accounts will need to be filed via software, and that includes dormant companies as well. Now, this is something that I've objected about directly with Companies House. I've gone up to bat for dormant companies on a number of occasions, but it's falling on deaf ears. I don't think it's fair that a dormant company would either need to engage an accountant or have to buy software to be able to file accounts with Companies House, but they're not interested in that. So that's something that's going to affect dormant companies in the future. And perhaps if your client is only protecting a company name because they thought that that might be a good idea, they may choose to actually dissolve that company rather than have to go through that procedure as well. Also, as I said before, Companies House fees have increased, and I've included a link on this slide as well, so that if you need to look at what the new fees will be, then you can go on and have a look at that. Now, the fee increase is because many of the changes that Companies House are making will require system development and also additional staff to be able to cope with all this extra work that they're going to have to do. And some measures will come in sooner than others. So some measures came in on the 4th of March. So we'll have a look at those now. So from the 4th of March, there are new rules for a registered office address. And I said before that a registered office address must be deemed to be appropriate. So what do they mean by that? Well, they mean that any documents delivered to the registered office address must be able to come to the attention of somebody acting on behalf of the company, and any documents that need to be signed for can be that there will be somebody there physically that will be able to sign for a letter that's delivered. It means that third parties can still provide registered office addresses to their clients. So if you're an accountant, then you can still be the registered office address because that mail is coming to the attention of somebody that's acting on behalf of the company. But you may be aware that there are some offices where they just have different post boxes for different companies and nobody's actually manning those. So in those cases, there wouldn't be anybody available to be able to sign for a document that's delivered there. So they're no longer allowed. I spoke to a local accountant recently, and they act in the village where I live. And it turned out that all the shops on the local high street had had their addresses used fraudulently for people setting up companies. Now, first of all, this came to the attention of the butcher when he received a letter at his address that was addressed to a different company. So he took it to the accountant, and it turned out that all the shops on the high street had had their addresses used fraudulently. So this is one way that Companies House can act upon situations like that a lot quicker with their new powers. So now that an address needs to be deemed to be appropriate, in that case it wasn't appropriate because it couldn't come to the attention of somebody acting on behalf of the company. So Companies House now have the powers to act upon situations like that where there is fraudulent activity. Every company must be deemed to have an email address as well, and that's new and existing companies. So on incorporations now, we have to submit an email address to Companies House. And for existing companies, since the 4th of March, the next confirmation statement that's filed, you must submit an email address for that company as well. Now, it can be the accountant's email address, it could be a service provider's email address, so long as an email address is delivered to Companies House and that meets the requirements. As to why they're doing this, well, once they've gone through the whole circle of a whole year, and that means that every company on the register has an email address, they'll stop sending out paper reminders and they'll send email reminders instead. I'm sure you can appreciate with the number of companies that there are and the cost involved in sending out paper reminders. So Companies House have decided that it would save a lot of money to send these reminders by email instead. So that's something to watch out for the future. You can also change the email address if you want to. There's a facility on Companies House website that you can go on. If you've got the authentication code, then you can log in and you can change the email address. So if you stop dealing with a client, then that's something that you could do. And also these email addresses won't be shown on the public register. So that's quite important as well, because I know that was an issue that a lot of people were concerned about. One of the other main changes since the 4th of March is that any new incorporation now, the subscribers must declare that they're forming the company for a lawful purpose. Now, I'd like to think that any company was being formed for a lawful purpose, but as we know, that's not always the case. So again, this is to strengthen Companies House powers so that they can prosecute where they find that the activities of a company may be unlawful in the future. And also every year when the confirmation statement's filed, the company must confirm that their future activities will be for a lawful purpose as well. So that's an ongoing requirement, not just on the incorporation of a company. And if that statement isn't made, then Companies House will reject the confirmation statement. Other changes from the 4th of March, Companies House have greater powers to be able to query information and reject information where it's inconsistent or incorrect. An example of that could be if a termination of appointments filed with Companies House, but that person had never been appointed with Companies House, then they can actually reject that form now because it's inconsistent with the information that's filed on the register. Whereas previously, if the form had been delivered correctly and completed correctly, then they had to accept it. So that's one of the changes that they will have with their new powers. And they can question things as well. So you may see more letters coming from Companies House where you've tried to file a form and they're not quite sure it's inconsistent with other information. So they can now query that. And because of that as well, it's taking longer to file forms and longer to incorporate companies as well. So that's something just to be aware of as well. Companies House can also use annotations on the register to highlight where there are inconsistencies. And they're taking steps to clean up the register. So again, in the future, you may see more letters coming out from Companies House where they're looking at information and dealing with any inconsistencies there. They also use data matching as well to identify and remove inaccurate information. And they also have the ability to share data with other government departments. Again, if they feel that there's unlawful activities, then they can share that information with law enforcement agencies as well. Now, these changes won't stop fraud from happening. There's still a long way to go with that, but they're definitely a step in the right direction. Companies House definitely welcome all these changes because they feel that until now their hands have been tied. Now, just to let you know about something that happened recently, you may have seen in the news that a lot of famous chefs, people like Heston Blumenthal, had their identity stolen and people were setting up companies, and particularly in that industry, targeting famous chefs, famous restaurants. The Ritz was targeted as well. They set up these companies with these people's names. They contacted suppliers and obtained goods because the suppliers wanted to deal with these people because it was high profile. And then they just disappear and the invoices would never be paid. So this was quite a big news story a couple of months ago. So again, moving forward, identity verification will stop this kind of event from happening. I also wanted to share with you a letter that's been doing the rounds. You may be aware of this. It looks quite genuine. Please ignore just the bit where the address is. We've just put that on there just to cover up who the letter was actually sent to. But generally that letter looks like it's come from Companies House. It has Companies House logo, the address, the email details, but it's saying that there's a problem with the setting up of the company and a payment must be made, and it's asking people to contact them and make payments. Obviously this is a scam letter. Companies House are aware of it as well, but it's just something to make your clients aware of as well. So how are the changes in legislation going to affect Companies House? Well, we've seen some examples of how they'll play a greater role in preventing further abuse of the register, and they'll be able to crack down on activities quicker as well. And this is all about making the register more reliable, more transparent, and that the information that's actually filed on the register will be of quality as well. Now, it's always the members of the public who are victims of fraud, and I've heard some terrible stories from Companies House of situations that they've been trying to tackle where people's identity has been stolen and their hands were tied. There wasn't much that they could do about that. So by giving Companies House greater powers, they'll be able to tackle fraud in a much better way in the future. So if we just have a look at identity verification now in a bit more detail. Now, most people that are listening now will have been used to fulfilling this requirement for years under the anti-money laundering regulations. We do, and our accountants and law firms have an obligation to conduct due diligence on their clients. But up until now, Companies House haven't. It's something that we've been trying to raise and fight for years, because if somebody wanted to do something that was untoward, they could just go directly to Companies House, register a company, and nobody was doing any checks. And this just did not seem right at all. So now, finally, Companies House will be making checks on people, and that's through the introduction of identity verification. Why now? A lot of this is on the back of the war with Russia and the Ukraine and Russian sanctions and knowing who exactly they're dealing with. Now, identity verification, or IDV, is a completely different concept to the anti-money laundering regulations. IDV is to confirm that it's a real person, and this will be confirmed through either facial recognition software or a certified copy of a passport. As I said before, this applies to directors and PSCs of companies, but it also applies to the people that are filing documents on behalf of other companies as well. And we'll have a look at who that means in a few moments. So it applies to new and existing companies, but generally IDV will be a one-off requirement unless somebody changes their name or something else about their identity as well. So there will be two identification routes. You'll be able to do it via Companies House. They are using a third party to be able to provide this for them. So an individual can go on to Companies House and be IDV'd, and they'll be issued with a code to confirm that they've gone through this process. The other route is via an ACSP. Now, an ACSP is an authorised corporate service provider. So an ACSP will need to register with Companies House, and once they're ready to go with IDV, will be given a 3-month window, and within that window, anybody that's wanting to IDV clients will be able to go to Companies House and register, and I'll go through what the criteria is for that in a moment. So by doing this, it will mean that either the people themselves will be filing documents with Companies House, or if somebody is filing on their behalf, they also will have been IDV'd as well. So this is to help prevent anonymous filings. So for ACSPs, the first thing is that they've said that ACSPs will need to operate at the same standard as Companies House when IDV takes place. Now, I think we can probably say that our standards will be higher than those of Companies House because we conduct thorough due diligence, not just confirming that it's a real person. We go further than that for the anti-money laundering regulations. So I don't think we need to worry about whether we'll be operating at the same standard or not. An ACSP must also be based in the UK, so overseas agents won't be able to file on behalf of UK companies. And also, the ACSP must be supervised by a relevant UK AML supervisor. And you won't be able to register as an ACSP unless you are supervised under the anti-money laundering regulations. When you make the application, Companies House will also be checking up and making sure that you are supervised, and there'll be a fit and proper test as well. So again, this is adding protection to make sure that those people that aren't authorised won't be able to file on behalf of companies with Companies House. So you can have individual ACSPs and non-individual ACSPs. So an example of a non-individual would be a company like our own, a firm of accountants, anybody that isn't an individual that's filing on behalf of other people. If it's an individual, then they must be IDV'd as well and registered with Companies House before they can submit documents. If it's a non-individual, then for us it will be the directors and the PSCs of our company would be IDV'd. That's an ongoing status as well, so Companies House will make continual checks to make sure that people are still registered as well. And then once we are registered, any of the employees for that non-individual ACSP will also be able to file on behalf of those companies as well. So being an ACSP, there's also a second part to this as well. So the introduction of IDV is the first part, and that you'll have to be an ACSP to be able to conduct that identity verification. But then they reckon about 6 months after that, there will also be presenter requirements. So the presenters legislation will mean that any documentation, you'll have to be an ACSP to file any documentation on behalf of somebody else. So firstly, the first part is for IDV, and that will be identifying the directors and the PSCs, and then at a later stage, it will be the presenters requirements. So what kind of forms will this include? Well, they've said, and they gave us a list, but it's not limited to this. So this will include incorporation documents, accounts, confirmation statements, charges, and insolvency documents as well. But as I said, it's not just limited to those type of documents. There'll be a huge number of people that will need to register as an ACSP to be able to deliver these documents to Companies House. As yet, they've not talked about how they will be able to do that or what the window will be for registering either. But again, there's going to be a huge number of people wanting to do that. So it's just something to bear in mind. Now, at the moment, they're talking about IDV being introduced in summer next year. So we're probably looking at 2026 for the presenters requirements. So we've got some time to prepare for that, but this is something that's going to come. It will need secondary legislation. Whether there are any delays due to the new government, we're not quite sure yet, but we will keep you fully informed about how that's all going to work. These changes have been long awaited and are very welcome as far as we're concerned. We think that this is a step in the right direction for ensuring who's filing with Companies House and making sure that the register is very much quality information that's filed on there. So just to recap, essentially it will only be the directors and employees of a company and authorised agents, ACSPs, who will be able to submit information to the register once the presenter's requirements are enacted. So to summarise the information for ACSPs, IDV will be implemented hopefully next year in the summer. IDV is to verify the identity of a director or a PSC and confirm that they're a real person, and this will be through facial recognition or a certified copy of a passport. A company can file for themselves, or once presenter requirements are enacted, anybody that files on behalf of another company will need to register as an ACSP. So we'll now move on to the last part of my presentation today, and that's on the Register of Overseas Entities. So this was some legislation that came in August 2022, and again on the back of the war with Russia and the Ukraine and Russian sanctions. And it was identified that there were properties and land in the UK that was owned by overseas entities, but nobody knew who were behind these overseas entities. So it was decided that there should be a piece of work in conjunction with Companies House and the Land Registry to establish who owned these overseas entities, so that if any sanctions needed to take place, they'd know who the owners of this property were. So this was a huge piece of work. They reckoned on there was over 30,000 overseas entities that own land or property in the UK. And you would need an agent as well to verify that information before it could be filed at Companies House. There were severe sanctions for those that did not comply, and on registration, Companies House would allocate a unique code to the overseas entity, and that would be needed in the future if they wanted to buy or sell property, and that transaction couldn't be completed without that code. So who needed to register? Well, the register was retrospective, so it went back to, for England and Wales, it went back to 1999. Any property or land owned in the UK since 1999, the overseas entity had to register. It was quite a complex process. We're dealing with overseas entities, and in some jurisdictions that's quite easy because they have similar public registers to the one that we have in the UK, but other places like the BVI or Panama, there aren't any public registers. So it's being able to obtain that information and then verify that information as well. And that's the job that the UK regulated agent had to complete. And then once they'd identified who the beneficial owners were, they needed to decide whether they would be registrable or not. And there was criteria for that as well. So firstly, they had to identify who the beneficial owner was. That could be an individual, another legal entity, as long as they maintained a PSC register, a government or public authority, because we could be dealing with embassies, a trustee of a trust as well, but they'd also want the trust information and who the beneficiaries of the trust were, or a member of a firm that's not a legal person under its governing law. So we'd look at beneficial owners, and then we'd see whether those beneficial owners were registrable. So there were criteria, a bit similar to PSC requirements, and there were conditions known as the nature of control. And they would be if the individual owned more than 25% of the shares in the overseas entity, or more than 25% of the voting rights, hold the right to remove or appoint a board member, or have the right to exercise significant control as well. So once this has all been established, then the agent needed to register on Companies House. Now, again, there are differences between the anti-money laundering regulations and the ROE verification procedure. It wasn't risk-based, and so that was one of the differences between the two ways of doing it. And also the information that was provided had to come from an independent source. So if it was on a register in another jurisdiction, that was really easy to identify, or it would be obtaining copies of registers of members, share certificates to validate that those people were the correct individuals that were the beneficial owners of that overseas entity. And you couldn't have a family member or a business associate identifying that information either. It needed to be somebody that was independent. So once this information had been verified, you would then be ready for registration. So the registration process was actually quite simple once the information had been collated. There was an online service. It took about 24 hours. The entity themselves could register online, but then the agent would need to fill in a form stating that they had verified that information. So it was a lot easier just to complete the process all as one. At the beginning, there were quite a lot of paper forms for different situations, but as time's gone on, then they've become less and less, and there's a much better process available now for registering. Also, each overseas entity is required to file an annual statement as well. Now, the cost of that filing fee for the annual statement is £234. If there haven't been any changes in the last year, the information's all correct, the entity can file that statement themselves. But if they have made a change, even an address change, then they must get an agent to verify that information as well. And there's a list of agents that can be found on Companies House website. All I would say is be careful and have a look into it. Because some of them are charging thousands of pounds for the registration as well. Also, you can remove an overseas entity if it no longer owns any property or land. Now, the filing fee for that is £706, so it's quite a high fee for that. However, even if it has been removed, then the information still remains on the public register, so that's worth pointing out to the clients as well. So just to summarise what we've been through and what we've had a look at today. So firstly, we've looked at the Economic Crime and Corporate Transparency Act. We've had a look at what it means to you and your clients. I've given an overview of ACSPs and the implications if you file documents on behalf of companies with Companies House. We've had a look at Companies House and what their new powers mean and how that can affect companies as well. And then just a very quick overview of the Register of Overseas Entities. So that brings us to the end of the presentation today. I'm just going to stop sharing my screen now and have a look whether that's brought me back. And now I'm going to ask my colleague Kerry Counter, who's been looking at the questions that have been put in the chat, and she'll put those to me now.
Thanks, Liz. I think the first batch of questions are all related to what services people can still provide for their clients. So we've had someone asking, will they still be able to file accounts without registering as an ACSP?
No, once that presenter legislation comes in, they will have to register as an ACSP to be able to deliver the accounts. But up until then, that's not a problem at all.
How long does that process take? Do we know?
For the registration, Companies House, I don't even think I've given any guidelines for that yet. I think at the moment they're just concentrating on what the process will actually be. I think they'll need to give quite a long window because there'll be a huge amount of people wanting to register as ACSPs, and they're going to have to check the information as well. So I don't think it's going to happen quickly. So all I can say is we'll let people know when that window is open, and I get in there quickly because I think as time goes on, it will just take longer and longer.
And can people still provide registered office addresses for their clients?
Yes, so as long as that address there's somebody there to accept the mail, and as long as that mail is then either forwarded onto your clients, or if you're acting on behalf of them, that you're dealing with that mail coming in, then that's absolutely fine, because it will fall into the criteria of being an appropriate address.
And the same for registered email address. Does that have to be the individual client, or can an accountant provide that?
No, and you can put any email address, so it could be a personal email address, the company email address, or again somebody acting on behalf of them, so long as somebody's keeping an eye on those emails coming in. It doesn't need to be the company's email address, it could be the accountant's.
Okay, thank you. And moving on to IDV, do we know when that will come into force?
At the moment, Companies House are saying summer 2025. It's already been delayed. It should have been towards the end of this year. But I will keep everybody advised as to what the timescales are, but that's the latest information that we have at the moment.
And will there be extra fees at Companies House when it does come into force?
There could well be. They haven't ruled out the possibility of increasing fees further. So the fee increase we saw this year will be for them preparing and putting all the plans in place. But if they feel, they work on a cost recovery basis, so if they feel they need to increase fees further to cover all the costs that they've incurred, then they will do that at a later stage.
And if someone's appointed in more than one company, do they have to go through the ID procedure every time?
No, it's a one-off requirement. So each person will be issued with a code, and then they can use that for any company that they're appointed to.
Okay, thank you. That's all the questions we've had in the chat. So thank you
All
very
right.
much.
Thank you, Kerry. Well, thank you everybody for attending today. I hope it's been useful. If you have any colleagues, we are recording today, so we can forward those. Just let me know if you want to receive a recording, and I will be sharing the slides as well. Just give me a couple of days to get those out to you. But thank you very much.